Hey everybody, today I am going to be reviewing Tokyo Story. This film came out in 1953. It was directed by Yasujiro Ozu. When people ask me to tell them, like, what do I think are some of the most perfect movies that I've ever seen, and it is a small list of movies, but Tokyo Story is always among them. I think it is one of the most perfectly executed films I have ever seen in my life, and it is one of the most emotionally impactful through its simplicity. This film to me has a subtlety about it that's like, it's almost like drinking green tea or something like that. Like, it's very subtle in terms of its flavors. It's very simple, yet somehow it has an effect on you. It's very soothing, it's very nurturing, and when you drink it, somehow, at least I do, I feel more calm, more centered, more clear-headed perhaps. And this movie, has that feeling to it. It really is kind of the perfect example of minimalism. There is not a moment in this film that isn't felt completely genuinely, from the heart, from the mind. There is not a second in the film that rings false, that feels manipulative or like drama for the sake of drama or appearing cinematic just for the sake of appearing cinematic. None of that bullshit. And this film, it delivers on every single moment absolutely perfectly. And, but for a film that is so focused and so clear in terms of its story and simple, as I've mentioned, the emotional weight of it at times can feel almost burdensome as a viewer. The quietness and everything, how it is expressing its themes and the emotions surrounding the themes is kind of with this wise sort of poetic grace. It explores the pain of loss. It explores time and how it just slips through our fingers, slips through our hands, and the pain that feels so apparent with all of that. I don't know, when I watched this movie the most recent time, to me, the feeling of it that if I can encapsulate it in one way in terms of how it felt for me, it would be like this movie feels like a warm bed sheet that is slowly getting colder and colder as somebody leaves it. The colder it gets, the more that you miss the person. It's that kind of intimate, kind of deep sort of pain and loss that feels somehow very encompassing by the end of it. Yet it never appears melodramatic in any way. In fact, the most effective moments for me are the moments where nothing is happening. None of it pertains to the plot. I've found myself at times, and this rarely happens, like this is how you know, at least for me, that it's a really good movie. I'd find myself just watching people look out a window or just sit there, and for some reason I had like tears in my eyes. And I think it was just because the moment was allowed to simply be. Like, there was nothing surrounding it. There was no like manipulation to it. And it's so rare that you see that, because in the scene, nothing needs to be said. Nothing really needs to be expressed at all. This film has the respect for itself and for us and the subject to just exist, and doing so in a manner that is so wise beyond its years and so wise, compared to almost every movie out there. And I think a lot of it is how it builds that authenticity. All of that kind of creates little bits of emotion here and there. Like a lot of the silent moments in the film where there is no dialogue and the camera is maybe stationary, where you're watching a character, I don't know, like dust a shelf. All of that creates the fingerprints of the world, I feel like, and this is a movie just about a working class family in a very typical sense. Even with the most mundane, routine tasks, like, just doing typical chores or just sitting around, whatever. Ozu somehow finds meaning in it, but not in a way where it's really specifically trying to draw something out of it. You just kind of making sense for why it should be there. His films have influenced tons of people over time, but the one that always pops into my mind, just because it struck me at an earlier age, was just, the filmmakers, like the anime filmmakers, like Miyazaki, being able to capture all of those little small incidental moments, being able to, animate a sequence where nothing happens, and those can be the most emotionally impactful. It gives you such a warmth and a texture, helps just build the authenticity of the world, and you just don't get that in a lot of American films. And then, I look at maybe a movie like Grave of the Fireflies is maybe the best example in terms of that influence of the minimalism and the realism. And that movie, even though very different in terms of subject matter, it works in a very similar way where, like the pain and the sorrow exists in the story, but the filmmaker isn't telling you necessarily how you should feel about it. Or I should say, it's not creating like one specific tone where all of your emotions kind of have to trickle into one steady stream. It's complicated. And fill those moments with all the things that the characters are contemplating, any sort of pain they're feeling, knowing that there is this shadow lurking over everything when it comes to these two young children in Grave of the Fireflies, or this family in Tokyo Story. I know I use this word a lot, but it's a very meditative film, Tokyo Story, and it takes its time. It allows you to take your time in terms of how you feel about it, in terms of how you experience it. You soak it in very, very slowly, to the point where you're not realizing what you're taking in. And to me, a lot of the best movies are the ones that move you in a way where you don't realize it until much later, after the fact. It creeps up on you and then it kind of overtakes you, like a memory that hasn't sunk in or something like that. And while this movie really does deal a lot with memory and like the nostalgia and the pain of all of that, it also has a lot to do with kind of sensory awareness, because like memory deals a lot with the sensory. The film understands, and I've said this before, some of the best movies that are able to recall memory or deal with memory are the ones where it's like, when you think of a memory that was meaningful to you, it's rarely the entire idea of the memory that you think of immediately, the things that emotionally impact you the most. And the first instant is typically like a sensory moment, like a smell that suddenly like knocks you over and it reminds you of a smell from a very specific memory in the past, or a sound. It's the sensory things that give you the resonance of a specific memory from the past. That's what creates a lot of the emotional impact. And those are the things that make it so personal. So when you watch this film, Tokyo Story, and you just see like a lot of pillow shots, as they're called, and you see like just like a random plant in a window, or you see just a sink of dirty dishes. Those don't mean anything, but it's a moment of reflection. And it's like those little things that you always remember when you think about the film. And I think what's most amazing about this film is how it's able to somehow capture the intimacy of emotion, yet it still ironically has kind of an emotionally detached quality to it, or I should say maybe an emotional distance, not detachment. It's like two contradictions both working perfectly at the same time, and so rarely does any movie find that balance in a tone perfectly like that. I feel it more through the camera movements in terms of the coldness, the distance, because the shots are distant. Like, like a family might be having dinner, but the camera won't be right in there with them. It might be in the next room, observing them through a threshold. And it's often kind of like lower down, like it's a low camera angle. But I think a lot of that also just kind of keeps things very level and eye line in terms of just the Japanese culture, because they do a lot like what I'm doing now, like, sitting down on the floor. But the way that the camera is situated, you may only see the family from a distance and maybe just through profile. So you're just getting kind of like hints of things here and there. Or it could just be you see someone moving down a hallway and you're just very distant in terms of where our perspective is from the camera. And in a way, it gives it more of a realistic quality, like as though you're just a member of the family living with them and you're just in a different room. And the way just that the house is divided with all the hallways and everything, it almost feels like a maze. So that also kind of contributes, I think, to the disconnect to a degree. But then it also makes the moments that are intimate, where the camera is just right across from somebody and they're looking directly into it, that, it creates that emotion, or I should say that emotion becomes more impactful because of that, especially with those grandparents. These are people coming to Tokyo to be with their family, their children and their grandchildren, and they're just realizing that they're just so out of touch. They're so out of touch. They don't really know their children. They don't really know their grandchildren. And this new kind of post-war version of what Japan is, what Tokyo is very jarring for them. They're realizing their time has passed. So yeah, that camera and everything really helps create that divide for them from their perspective. But we see so much of that changing world in Japan, in Asia, all over the world, just represented through the most brilliant kind of shot compositions. You'll have a very clean kind of natural landscape, for example, that looks very flat in terms of the way it's shot. But then you have these power lines, these wires cutting through the frame, and the emptiness of these spaces and the way that these wires and those lines clash with all of that, I found to be very effective. With Ozu, he will find ways of making kind of a clean, minimalist composition have a sort of starkness to it, or something that is maybe full of melancholy. And the new world, in a way, is sort of slicing through the old, through the compositions here. Yet even though there is this like symbol of the industrial world clashing with the natural, it's not all just like evil triumphing over good or anything like that. I think there's just a natural just melancholy to the whole thing. There's just a beauty to it that is mixed. It's both dark and beautiful. But as I said, little by little, you start to absorb all of the emotions of the film. And by the end, you feel that sense of time and how it swallows us whole. And then life just kind of goes on. This movie somehow feels like it can give you the perspective of what it means to be very young, but also very old, both at the same time, which is, of course, an amazing thing, but you know, it's amazing because I don't know what it's like to be old yet. But I feel that. I feel the weight of that mortality through these characters, through the grandparents, and that disconnect from their family. Though, you know, you do find that emotional kind of sweet spot with the character of Noriko, because she has a very kind nature, a very nurturing selflessness to her. She has just a breathtaking smile. It is so gentle, and something that even when I saw this movie the first time, probably like, what, 10, 11 years ago, I never forgot that smile, because she can smile in a way that feels very reassuring to you. Yet at the same time, there is an emptiness. You feel a sort of pain and loss through her eyes as well. Just a wonderful actress she is, and I get why Ozu liked her so much. They did collaborate quite often. But yeah, this is one of those movies. It's very hard to be critical of it because I see very little to criticize about it. I've been complaining a lot recently about such films as like Nomadland, for example, where, you know, it's going for that quality, trying to reach that resonance of simplicity that you might get from a movie like this, but it doesn't trust in those silences. And I've also complained about movies like Malcolm and Marie, for example, and especially movies like I Care a Lot, that have all of these like grandiose kind of thematic claims while also feeding into its own hypocrisy. There is none of that here. There is absolutely none of it. This film is so keen. It is so aware. It is so wise. It is so balanced in a way that pierces through all of that excess. It came out, what, like 70 years ago? Something like that. And yet it feels completely timeless in a way that I think it could easily be released today and have just as much of an emotional impact as it did back then. Not an ounce of gratuity, not a moment that isn't full of life and full of spirit. A film about regret, about loss of love, about loss of connection, loss of identity, and coming to terms with all of that. It brings me nearly to tears when I do watch the film, and if there's ever a film I could recommend to the cinephiles out there, the people who really, really respect film, you've got to watch this one. You will never find a more perfect film. But that's the review. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you're really a fan of movies like this, or you're just a fan of supporting artists, starving artists like myself, I am an artist, and if you are interested in any prints of my work or commission portraits, I have all of that information in my website below, deepfocuslens.com. If you want something, you're interested in a commission, and you have any questions, just email me. I have my email below as well. I'm happy to chit chat with you about it. But beyond that, here are my Patreon supporters. Thank you guys again so much for your support. It means the world. And if you want to become a patron, the link is below for that, as well as my social media information. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.